Cura was supposed to be gone, deported and erased from U.S. soil. But instead, he vanished into the shadows, building a ruthless empire that stretched across borders. Now, with bodies piling up and communities living in fear, the question haunting investigators is simple: how did one man slip through the cracks and turn chaos into power? Authorities believed they had finally dealt a crushing blow to MS-13, the notorious gang known for its extreme violence and control over many neighborhoods. Over the years, law enforcement agencies had been engaged in a relentless battle to dismantle the gang's leadership. After years of surveillance, arrests, and investigations, they succeeded in deporting several of the gang's most powerful leaders back to El Salvador. This move was seen as a major victory. With the gang's heads removed from the U.S., officials assumed the organization would weaken, splinter, and lose its grip on the streets. The deportation sent shockwaves through the gang's ranks. MS-13, which had thrived on intimidation and brutal enforcement, suddenly found itself without the leadership that kept it coordinated. Local authorities reported a drop in violent incidents linked to the gang, and there was a hopeful sense that the worst was over. Media outlets ran stories declaring the gang's decline, and communities began to breathe a little easier. After all, the removal of these key figures seemed like a definitive win against a dangerous enemy. But what officials didn't realize at the time was that this apparent victory was only the beginning of a new, far more dangerous chapter. Rather than dissolving under pressure, the gang began to adapt in ways no one expected. The power vacuum left behind by the deportations did not weaken MS-13. It gave rise to new leaders who were more secretive, more ruthless, and smarter about avoiding law enforcement. The gang structure shifted from a visible network of street-level enforcers to a hidden, well-organized system that spanned borders. Behind this transformation was a mysterious figure who would later become known as Cura. At the time, very few people had heard of him. Unlike the previous leaders, who were often flamboyant and overt in their displays of power, Cura was quiet and calculating. He operated from the shadows, building alliances and orchestrating moves that kept the gang's operations intact even when it seemed they were falling apart. His ability to manipulate situations and control people made him an emerging force within the gang's ranks. Cura understood something crucial: simply removing leaders was not enough to stop the gang. MS-13's strength came from its ability to adapt, to regenerate, and to exploit chaos. With the leadership deported, he saw an opportunity to reshape the organization and extend its reach beyond what had ever been imagined. He used the confusion and fear following the deportations to recruit new members, expand drug trafficking routes, and deepen the gang influence in both the U.S. and Central America. As months passed, reports of gang-related violence began to trickle back, but they were different from before, more calculated and coordinated. The streets were no longer ruled by open displays of aggression, but by a network that operated with precision and secrecy. It became clear that the deportations had not been the death knell many hoped for. Instead, they had inadvertently cleared the way for a more dangerous evolution of MS-13. This initial chapter in the story of MS-13's resurgence is crucial to understanding how what seemed like a victory for law enforcement actually sowed the seeds for the gang's rebirth. The fall of the old guard was only the beginning of a new reign of terror, led by a figure whose real identity and plans were still hidden from view. The battle against MS-13 was far from over. It had just entered a darker, more complex phase. In the wake of the deportations that shook MS-13 to its core, a new figure quietly emerged from the shadows, changing the gang's trajectory in ways no one had predicted. This figure was known only by his nickname, Cura, which means the priest. Unlike the violent, outspoken leaders who had dominated the gang before, Cura was different, methodical, secretive, and intensely strategic. His rise was not marked by loud displays of power or flashy violence, but by careful moves that strengthened the gang from within, transforming it into a more elusive and dangerous organization. Cura's approach to leadership was subtle yet ruthless. He understood that the previous gang bosses had made themselves targets by being too visible, too aggressive, and too unpredictable. Instead of following in their footsteps, he chose to operate under the radar. His influence spread quietly through whispers, coded messages, and trusted lieutenants who reported directly to him. This allowed him to maintain control without attracting unnecessary attention from law enforcement or rival gangs. One of Cura's key tactics was to focus on rebuilding the gang's internal structure. He strengthened loyalty by enforcing strict rules and punishing betrayal swiftly and mercilessly. His leadership style emphasized discipline and unity, which helped prevent the gang from splintering after the chaos of the deportations. He also encouraged members to blend into their communities, making it harder for police to identify who was involved and who wasn't. This strategy turned MS-13 from a loose collection of violent street crews into a highly organized network with clear chains of command. Cura was also a master of alliances. He reached out to other criminal organizations and corrupt officials, forging partnerships that expanded the gang's reach and resources. Through these connections, MS-13 was able to diversify its criminal enterprises, moving beyond street-level drug sales and into larger, more profitable ventures like human trafficking, extortion, and money laundering. These new operations provided steady income, which funded weapons, bribes, and the expansion of their influence. The nickname Cura itself carried a sinister irony. While priests are associated with guidance and protection, this man was leading a criminal empire marked by fear and violence. The name likely came from his calm demeanor and the respect he commanded, almost like a religious figure in his community. But beneath that calm exterior was a ruthless mind, willing to do whatever it took to secure power and control. As Cura solidified his position, the gang began to spread its influence beyond the neighborhoods where it had traditionally operated. His vision extended across cities and borders, building a network that connected the gang's roots in Central America with its strongholds in the United States. This transnational approach was unprecedented for MS-13. It allowed for the rapid movement of drugs, weapons, and people, and made it nearly impossible for authorities to dismantle the entire organization. Under Cura's leadership, MS-13 became more than just a street gang. It evolved into a sophisticated criminal enterprise with tentacles reaching far beyond what law enforcement had imagined. His ability to adapt the gang's tactics and expand its operations marked the beginning of a new era for MS-13, one that would challenge investigators and communities alike for years to come. Despite his growing power, Cura remained a mystery. Few had seen him, and fewer still knew his true identity. His silence and secrecy only added to his legend and fear. To the outside world, he was a ghost, an unseen puppet master pulling the strings of one of the most feared gangs in history. As MS-13 prepared to strike again under his command, no one could have predicted just how far this quiet, calculating leader would go. Cura's rise to power wasn't confined to the streets of the United States. He understood early on that the strength of MS-13 was deeply rooted in its connections across borders, particularly in Central America. The gang's origin in El Salvador and its sprawling networks in Honduras and Guatemala gave it a unique advantage over other criminal groups. Cura saw an opportunity to leverage these cross-border ties to create a sprawling criminal empire that could evade law enforcement by moving seamlessly between countries. Central to Cura's strategy was the expansion of MS-13's operations beyond simple street-level violence and drug dealing. He worked tirelessly to build a complex network that coordinated trafficking routes for drugs, weapons, and even people. These routes stretched across highways, rural backroads, and remote border crossings, all carefully managed to avoid detection. The gang's smuggling activities became more efficient and sophisticated under his leadership, enabling them to move contraband quickly and discreetly. Recruitment was another crucial element of this expansion. Cura recognized that the gang's future depended on constantly replenishing its ranks with new members. He tapped into refugee populations and marginalized communities across Central America and the U.S., where poverty and lack of opportunities made young people vulnerable to gang influence. Recruitment wasn't limited to coercion. It also involved offering a sense of belonging, power, and protection to those who felt abandoned by society. With Cura at the helm, MS-13's network began to function like a well-oiled machine. Leaders in El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala communicated regularly with those in the United States, sharing intelligence, coordinating attacks, and managing resources. This coordination was unprecedented for the gang. Previously, local factions operated somewhat independently, but under Cura's vision, MS-13 became a unified organization with a shared goal and strategy. This cross-border network also allowed the gang to exploit weaknesses in immigration enforcement and law enforcement cooperation between countries. Corrupt officials and law enforcement officers were bribed or threatened into turning a blind eye, allowing MS-13 to operate with relative impunity. This corruption was a key factor in the gang's ability to sustain its operations despite efforts to dismantle it. Cura's strategy extended beyond crime into psychological warfare. By maintaining a presence in multiple countries, MS-13 was able to send a message of omnipresence and inevitability. Communities on both sides of the border lived in fear, knowing that the gang's reach was vast and that its members could strike anywhere. This fear became a tool to control neighborhoods, silence witnesses, and discourage cooperation with the police. The expansion also brought new challenges. Managing a transnational gang required Cura to delegate significant authority to trusted lieutenants, which increased the risk of betrayal or infighting. However, his strict enforcement of loyalty and his reputation for ruthless punishment kept internal conflicts in check. The gang's discipline was a major factor in its resilience. By expanding MS-13's influence across borders, Cura not only made the gang harder to dismantle but also positioned it as one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the Americas. His vision transformed MS-13 from a fragmented group of street gangs into a sprawling, coordinated empire capable of intimidating governments and communities alike. This evolution marked a turning point in the gang's history, one that law enforcement agencies around the world were only beginning to understand. The cross-border roots that Cura cultivated were not just a strategic advantage. They became the foundation of a new MS-13, one that was bigger, smarter, and deadlier than ever before. Years after the initial wave of deportations that many believed had weakened MS-13, a disturbing trend began to emerge. Bodies started turning up again in neighborhoods across the United States, brutally killed with the same savage precision that had once defined the gang's reign of terror. The violence wasn't random or chaotic, it was methodical and cold. A message sent with chilling clarity. It became clear that MS-13 was back, and it was stronger and more organized than ever. These killings were shocking in their brutality. Victims were often found with multiple stab wounds, sometimes with signs of torture or mutilation, clear indicators that the gang was asserting dominance through fear. The methods mirrored those used years before, making it evident that the Resurgence was not the work of a new or unrelated group. Instead, it bore the unmistakable signature of MS-13's ruthless culture, a dark mark that had haunted communities for decades. For law enforcement and the public, the return of this level of violence was a wake-up call. Many had hoped that deporting the gang's leaders had shattered the organization beyond repair, but instead, these killings revealed that the gang had not only survived, it had evolved. The violence was more strategic, less impulsive. It appeared designed to send messages to rival gangs, to intimidate witnesses, and to maintain control over territories. The gang was no longer just about chaos, it was about calculated power. Investigators noticed a key difference in this new wave of violence. The killings were carried out with precision and planning. Unlike earlier outbreaks of brutality that sometimes involved reckless street fights or spur-of-the-moment revenge, these attacks were targeted. Victims were carefully selected, often after surveillance and intelligence gathering. This pointed to a leadership that valued order within the chaos, controlling violence as a tool to enforce discipline and loyalty. The community's fear deepened as bodies continued to surface, often in places where residents had previously felt safe. The gang's reach seemed to have expanded beyond traditional strongholds, and its ability to evade capture made it feel unstoppable. Families lived with constant anxiety, afraid to speak out or cooperate with police. This atmosphere of terror was exactly what MS-13 relied on to maintain its grip. At the same time, the gang used its growing network to silence dissent and recruit new members. The cycle of violence became self-perpetuating. Each brutal killing was followed by new threats and recruitment efforts, often targeting vulnerable youth who saw no other way out. This recruitment was not just about numbers, it was about building loyalty to Cura's vision of a united, fearsome gang. Law enforcement agencies found themselves at a crossroads. Traditional methods of combating street gangs were proving ineffective against this new, highly organized MS-13. The gang's transnational operations and encrypted communications complicated investigations. The usual tactics of arrests and deportations no longer worked as they once did. MS-13 had changed, and so had the rules of engagement. The resurgence of violence forced a renewed focus on MS-13 as a national threat. Task forces were reassembled, and federal resources were poured into understanding the gang's new structure and tactics. Still, despite increased efforts, The gang's ability to stay one step ahead of authorities was frustratingly clear. This wave of violence marked a turning point. It demonstrated that MS-13 was not just surviving, it was thriving under Cura's leadership. The gang's brutal precision and ability to spread fear sent a grim message. The battle against MS-13 was far from over. The streets once again echoed with the threat of violence, and communities braced themselves for the long fight ahead. As the bodies kept appearing and the brutality escalated, investigators quickly realized that this resurgence of MS-13 was unlike anything they had encountered before. The trail left by the gang's activities was more elusive, the usual signs of their presence harder to detect. It became clear that MS-13 had evolved not just in its reach, but in how it operated, making it a far more difficult adversary to track and dismantle. One of the most puzzling aspects of this new wave of violence was the near-total silence surrounding it. Witnesses who once might have come forward with information were now terrified into silence, disappearing from neighborhoods or refusing to speak. Those who did know something were often too frightened to cooperate, fearing brutal retaliation. The gang's reputation for savage punishment was enough to keep entire communities locked in. This wave of violence marked a turning point. It demonstrated that MS-13 was not just surviving, it was thriving under Cura's leadership. The gang's brutal precision and ability to spread fear sent a grim message. The battle against MS-13 was far from over. The streets once again echoed with the threat of violence, and communities braced themselves for the long fight ahead. As the bodies kept appearing and the brutality escalated, investigators quickly realized that this resurgence of MS-13 was unlike anything they had encountered before. The trail left by the gang's activities was more elusive, the usual signs of their presence harder to detect. It became clear that MS-13 had evolved not just in its reach, but in how it operated, making it a far more difficult adversary to track and dismantle. One of the most puzzling aspects of this new wave of violence was the near-total silence surrounding it. Witnesses who once might have come forward with information were now terrified into silence, disappearing from neighborhoods or refusing to speak. Those who did know something were often too frightened to cooperate, fearing brutal retaliation. The gang's reputation for savage punishment was enough to keep entire communities locked in fear, effectively cutting off the flow of intelligence to law enforcement. Informants who had been invaluable in past investigations were vanishing under mysterious circumstances. Some simply stopped communicating, while others were found dead under suspicious circumstances. The atmosphere of terror created by MS-13 had created an almost impenetrable wall between the gang and those trying to expose it. Without inside information, investigators found themselves operating in the dark. Adding to the challenge was the gang's ability to keep its communications secure. Unlike before, when members might be careless with phone calls or meetings, the new MS-13 leadership enforced strict protocols to avoid detection. Messages were passed through trusted intermediaries, encrypted apps, or face-to-face meetings in carefully chosen locations. This level of operational security made it difficult for authorities to intercept plans or anticipate attacks. Surveillance efforts that had worked in the past were less effective. Members learned to recognize law enforcement tactics and quickly adapted, changing meeting spots and routines. The gang's leaders were careful to shield themselves from direct exposure, instead using layers of intermediaries to communicate orders. This created a buffer that protected them from arrest and kept the gang's hierarchy intact. Geographically, MS-13 had become more dispersed and mobile. Instead of controlling a single neighborhood or city block, the gang's influence was spread across multiple states and even countries. Members could move quickly across borders, blending into new communities or hiding in plain sight. This mobility complicated efforts to track the gang's movements or predict where violence might erupt next. Despite these challenges, law enforcement agencies refused to back down. Task forces retooled their strategies, focusing on building relationships within communities to encourage cooperation and protect witnesses. New technologies were deployed to monitor encrypted communications and track financial transactions. Investigators also expanded their focus beyond street-level crime, targeting the gang's leadership and infrastructure. Still, the elusive nature of this new MS-13 left many frustrated. It was clear that the gang had learned from past mistakes, and was now operating like a covert organization rather than a typical street gang. The usual signs of gang activity, graffiti tags, open drug sales, Loud confrontations were increasingly rare. Instead, violence was sudden and surgical, leaving little time for intervention. This transformation forced law enforcement and communities alike to rethink their approach to the gang threat. The familiar battle lines had shifted, and the enemy was no longer easily identifiable. MS-13 had become a shadowy force, striking unpredictably and disappearing before anyone could respond. The question was no longer if the gang would act, but when and where they would strike next. The vanishing trail left by MS-13 during this period highlighted a chilling reality. The gang had evolved into a more sophisticated and dangerous entity. For investigators, the challenge was immense: how to fight an enemy that no longer played by the old rules, and how to protect communities caught in the crossfire of a war they barely understood. The breakthrough in the investigation came when a painstaking trail of clues finally led law enforcement to a shocking discovery. Cura, the elusive leader believed to have been deported years ago, had never actually left the United States. This revelation sent ripples through the law enforcement community, shaking the very foundation of their understanding of MS-13's operations and leadership. For years, official records showed that Cura had been deported back to El Salvador, along with other gang leaders during the initial crackdown. This supposed removal was considered a major success and a key factor in the gang's temporary decline. But new evidence revealed that this deportation had been a carefully orchestrated deception, engineered with the help of a corrupt immigration agent who had falsified documents and manipulated official records. The corrupt agent's involvement was a stunning betrayal. Task force investigators uncovered a network of bribery and collusion that allowed Cura to evade detection and remain in the country under a false identity. The agent, motivated by greed or intimidation or perhaps both, had exploited the system's weaknesses, creating a loophole that kept one of the most dangerous gang leaders hidden in plain sight. Cura's faked deportation was a masterstroke of deception that explained how the gang had managed to rebuild its network so quickly and efficiently. While authorities believed he was thousands of miles away, he was actively managing operations, recruiting members, and directing violent attacks from within the United States. This ability to operate undetected gave MS-13 an edge that few could match. The discovery raised serious questions about the integrity of the immigration and law enforcement systems. How many other criminals had exploited similar schemes? How deep did the corruption run? Investigators realized that rooting out gang leadership would require more than just arrests. It demanded a complete overhaul of the system that had allowed Cura to slip through the cracks. Law enforcement agencies intensified their efforts to track down Cura's current whereabouts. They pieced together his movements through surveillance, informants, and digital footprints. Slowly, the web of his network began to unravel, revealing a sprawling operation with cells in multiple states and connections to Central America. The investigation also shed light on how Cura maintained control while avoiding direct exposure. Using layers of trusted lieutenants and encrypted communications, he directed MS-13's activities from the shadows. His ability to stay hidden while commanding such a violent empire made him one of the most dangerous figures law enforcement had ever faced. This revelation transformed the entire fight against MS-13. Instead of chasing ghost stories and fractured gangs, authorities now had a clear target, a man who had managed to outsmart the system and maintain his grip on power for years. The challenge was immense, capturing a leader who was as elusive as he was ruthless, and dismantling a network that had grown in his absence. For communities affected by MS-13's violence, the discovery was both terrifying and hopeful. It explained why the gang had returned with such deadly force and suggested that the key to stopping them might lie in capturing one man. But it also underscored the difficulty ahead, a reminder that Cura was no ordinary criminal, but a cunning mastermind who had turned deception into survival. The uncovering of Cura's faked deportation was a turning point in the investigation, setting the stage for a high-stakes pursuit that would test the limits of law enforcement and expose the vulnerabilities in the fight against transnational gangs. It was clear that the battle was far from over and that the real war was just beginning. With the shocking revelation that Cura had never actually left the country, law enforcement agencies faced a new and daunting challenge, tracking down a criminal mastermind who had spent years hiding in plain sight. The man behind MS-13's Resurgence was not just a ruthless gang leader but a careful strategist who had built layers of protection around himself, making him incredibly difficult to find or arrest. Cura's ability to remain undetected was a testament to his understanding of both the gang's operations and the weaknesses within the system. He rarely appeared in public or communicated directly with lower-ranking members. Instead, he operated through trusted lieutenants and intermediaries, ensuring that his real identity and location stayed concealed. Every message he sent was carefully coded, and every meeting was planned to avoid surveillance. The investigation into Cura's whereabouts became a high-stakes game of cat and mouse. Federal agents and local law enforcement pooled resources and intelligence, forming multi-agency task forces dedicated solely to finding him. They combed through mountains of data, phone records, financial transactions, surveillance footage, and tips from informants. Despite the effort, Cura's trail remained cold for months, frustrating investigators and heightening the tension within the agencies. One of the critical breakthroughs came when agents identified a pattern in the gang's activities, a subtle but consistent flow of resources and communications that pointed back to a central command. This pattern suggested that Cura was still orchestrating operations from within the U.S., even if his physical presence was hidden. Analysts began focusing on a small group of trusted lieutenants who had close connections to both the street-level members and the higher leadership. Surveillance on these lieutenants provided glimpses into the gang's inner workings. Agents observed secretive meetings in abandoned buildings, coded language used in conversations, and unusual financial transactions that indicated the movement of illicit funds. Each piece of information helped to narrow down possible locations where Cura might be hiding or directing operations. The investigators also uncovered the extent of Cura's influence over corrupt officials. Bribes and threats had ensured that some local law enforcement officers and immigration agents looked the other way, making the investigation more complicated. This corruption created a web of protection that allowed Cura to operate without fear of immediate arrest. Unraveling these connections became a key focus for the task forces, aiming to cut off the gang's inside support. Throughout this intense search, communities affected by MS-13's violence grew anxious and wary. The gang's reputation for swift and brutal retaliation against perceived traitors made potential informants reluctant to come forward. This silence allowed Cura's network to continue functioning, increasing the urgency for law enforcement to act quickly and decisively. As the manhunt dragged on, pressure mounted on the agencies to deliver results. Media coverage intensified, with stories highlighting the gang's brutal crimes and the mysterious figure pulling the strings. The public demanded answers and justice, while investigators worked behind the scenes to avoid tipping off their elusive target. Despite the challenges, the search for Cura revealed the resilience and adaptability of law enforcement in the face of a new breed of criminal leader. It became clear that capturing him would require not just traditional policing but innovative tactics, community cooperation, and cutting-edge technology. The stakes had never been higher because Cura was more than just a gang leader. He was a symbol of the gang's survival and a key to ending its reign of terror once and for all. The hunt for Cura was far from over, but every step forward brought investigators closer to confronting the man who had turned MS-13 into an unstoppable force. The coming showdown promised to be dangerous, complex, and pivotal in the fight against one of the most violent gangs in modern history. As investigators zeroed in on Cura's network, a darker and more complex picture began to emerge, one that revealed just how deeply entrenched the gang's influence had become within institutions meant to fight crime. The corrupt agent who had facilitated Cura's fake deportation was only the tip of the iceberg. Further inquiries uncovered a web of officials, law enforcement officers, and even politicians who had been compromised, willingly or under duress, by MS-13's reach. This corruption was not isolated to one city or agency, but spanned multiple jurisdictions, complicating efforts to dismantle the gang's operations. Bribes, threats, and manipulation had created a shadow network of protectors, allowing Cura and his lieutenants to operate with near immunity. In some cases, officers who should have been investigating the gang instead provided it with insider information or turned a blind eye to their activities. The depth of this corruption shocked even seasoned investigators. It meant that efforts to capture Cura were being undermined from within, and that trusted institutions were compromised. The gang's ability to exploit these vulnerabilities was a key reason it had grown stronger despite years of law enforcement pressure. Cura's strategy extended beyond simply bribing or intimidating officials. He carefully cultivated a reputation that demanded respect and fear, even among those sworn to uphold the law. Corrupt officers who cooperated with him often did so not just for money, but because they feared violent repercussions if they refused. This climate of fear made rooting out corruption incredibly dangerous and complex. Recognizing the threat, federal agencies launched parallel investigations aimed at exposing and removing corrupt officials. Undercover operations, audits, and internal affairs probes were intensified to cleanse the system. This internal battle was difficult, as it required balancing the need to preserve secrecy with the urgency of dismantling the gang's protective shield. Meanwhile, Cura continued to command his empire with chilling efficiency. His network exploited this corruption to expand drug trafficking routes, extend extortion schemes, and manage human trafficking operations. The gang's activities brought in millions of dollars, funding weapons, bribes, and continued recruitment efforts. In some areas, the corruption had become so pervasive that entire police departments were under suspicion. Communities lost trust in those meant to protect them, making cooperation